Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this story. Towards the end of the Parshat Behaalotcha, Miriam, Moshe's sister, speaks some negative, quote, gossip about her brother, Moshe, which is called Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is non-objective, non-essential, derogatory speech about somebody. So if you say something about somebody that's there's a purpose to, I want to tell a parent or a teacher that your child has an issue that needs to be dealt with, that's not Lashon Hara. Lashon Hara is when it's unnecessary. And what happens is that Miriam finds out, Rashi goes through exactly how she found out, but Miriam found out that Moshe was not spending a lot of time with his wife, Zipporah. And the reason is because Moshe had to be ready to get prophecies from Hashem. And he was called over to the Mishkan, to the tabernacle, which was the temporary temple, and he had to be ready at all times to get these messages from Hashem. And so therefore he had basically separated from being with his wife for a period. So Miriam finds out about this, and she tells her other brother, who's Aaron. If you take a look at the pasuk over here, it says Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moshe because of the Cushite woman he had married. He had married a Cushite woman. So that's referring to Zipporah. Now, Rashi explains exactly what a Cushite means. Usually Cush is the name of a place. In this case, Rashi says it doesn't mean that. It was a reference to Zipporah because she was very beautiful, etc. But anyway, they said a derogatory statement about Moshe, which was not necessary to say. There was no benefit to it. Hashem gets very upset with them. And but before that, let's see the next pasuk. So they said, Harak ach b'Moshe diber Hashem. Did God only speak with Moshe? Gam banu diber vayishma Hashem. But Hashem spoke with us too. Hashem spoke to all the Jewish people by Sinai. So why does Moshe think he's so special? Because he's a prophet and he's not spending time with his wife. He spoke to everyone too. Now, how did Moshe react to all of this? When Moshe found out people were slighting him and speaking derogatorily about him, how did he react? So it says, "V'ha'ish Moshe anav me'od mikol ha'adam asher al pnei adama." Moshe was a very humble man, more so than any other man on the earth. Moshe was more humble than anyone else. So in other words, the pasuk is telling us that Moshe didn't take it as a slight. He let it go. It didn't bother him. He wasn't troubled by it because he was so humble. What I want to speak about tonight is the topic of humility. It's very clear in Jewish writings and Jewish texts that it's a very important trait for a person not to be arrogant, and a person should be humble. And the springboard that I want to use to have this discussion is this pasuk over here, because this pasuk is so counterintuitive. What could it possibly mean that Moshe was more humble than anyone? How could Moshe not recognize his greatness? Did he not realize that he was the catalyst for all the miracles in Egypt? He was the one who went in front of Pharaoh. Of all the Jews, he was the one who was chosen to be the leader. Hashem says, you're the one to go in front of Pharaoh. Of all the Jews, he was the one who was chosen to raise his staff and use his staff to make all the miracles. And then, of course, the climax was when they left Egypt. And Moshe split the sea. Of course, it was Hashem who split the sea, but Moshe was the one who did the physical act of lifting up his rod, which split the sea. Moshe wasn't aware. He forgot all this recent history. He wasn't aware of what he accomplished. How do we possibly understand what it means that Moshe was so humble? Usually we think of humility as, I don't think I'm so great. How could Moshe not have known how great he was? Every single person recognized that the nation only survived because of the miracles that Moshe was the one to perform. It was Hashem, but Moshe was the one who brought the miracles about. So how can we explain this pasuk? Moshe was more humble than anybody else. What could that possibly mean? Okay, now I want to focus on another area of the Chumash where it spells out very clearly the praises of Moshe. And that is at the end of the Torah, right when the Torah ends. So it speaks about Moshe's death. And it says very clearly in the Torah V'lo kam navi od b'Yisrael. Another prophet never rose in amongst the Jewish people like Moshe, whom Hashem had singled out face to face. Hashem spoke to him face to face like you would speak to a friend. So, and it continues. L'chol ha'otot v'hamoftim. There's never been anyone who made all the signs and the wonders asher shlacho Hashem lasod be'eretz Mitzrayim, that God sent him to do in the land of Egypt. L'Pharaoh, in front of Pharaoh, l'chol avadav, and all of Pharaoh's servants, l'chol artzo, and to all his land, l'chol hayara chazaka, and all the great might, l'chol hamorah gadol, and all the awesome power that Moshe displayed before all of Israel. So the Torah essentially ends with a eulogy. A eulogy is a speech about somebody who passes away. A eulogy about Moshe, and it said there's never been another prophet like him. No one who was able to perform all the wonders and the signs and the miracles that he did, and his mighty arm that he displayed by confronting Pharaoh. So what does it mean? How are we possibly supposed to understand? It means that Moshe was humble more than anyone else. How could he not recognize his greatness? I mean, he'd have to have total amnesia not to recognize who he was. So that's one question. And a second question is that what makes the Chumash is that it was taught to us through the prophecy of Moshe. Moshe was the prophet who taught us the 5 books of the Chumash. Then there's another 19 books of prophets, which were other prophets, but they were not on the level of Moshe. Moshe taught the entire Torah to us. That means it was Moshe who said the words. There was never somebody as humble as Moshe. Moshe literally said those words over to Bnei Israel. Moshe was the one who said the words over that, and Moshe went in front of Pharaoh, and Moshe raised his staff. Moshe repeated these things. So how could he possibly not recognize his greatness? So for Cami, who just joined us from something which was obviously more important, the second question we asked was Moshe is the one who's the prophet who taught us the Torah. That means he said these verses to us. He said the verses. There was never somebody as humble as Moshe. He was the one who taught us everything Moshe did in Egypt. So how are we to understand that Moshe was so humble? So obviously what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to alter our understanding of what humility is. What is humility versus arrogance? We're going to have to try to redefine that. Now, before we proceed, I want to go to a Mishnah on Pirkei Avot. In case you're unfamiliar, Pirkei Avot is the one body of Mishnah which deals with ethics. So it says over here in Mishnah number 4, here in chapter 4, Rabbi Levitas ish Yavne Omer. Rabbi Levitas, a man from Yavne, said, Ma'od ma'od have shval ruach. A person should be exceedingly humble, not to be a big shot, not to go around to be arrogant and share, how great you are with everybody. A person should be exceedingly humble. Why? Shetikvat enosh rima. At the end of the day, everybody's going to be eaten by worms, which is a very pleasant thought. So don't focus on how great you are. Just you should be really humble. At the end of the day, we're flesh and blood is what it's saying. Now, Maimonides picks up on this Mishnah. Maimonides also has a section which deals with ethics. It's called the laws of Deot. Deot means character traits. And Maimonides notices that it says over here an expression that a person should be very, very humble twice. Now, what does Maimonides do with that? So let's enter the world of Maimonides. Okay, as all of you have been in my class, so you know how important Maimonides is to Jewish thought. And Maimonides says over here that, I'm just scrolling down. So he says that a person has there's a lot of different character traits. You can be generous, you can be stingy. You can be very patient, or you can be very impetuous, impulsive. A lot of different traits a person can have. How should one act in life with the traits that they are given by God? So Maimonides says that the general rule a person should have is walk in the middle path. Don't just give all your money away without thinking. You should be, on the other hand, don't be too stingy. You should walk in the middle. The same thing is true with other traits. Don't be overly impatient and impetuous, but at the same time, you also shouldn't be, you shouldn't be too lazy either. You got to be in the middle. So look at what Maimonides says over here, law number 3. The two extremes of each trait, which are at a distance from one another, do not reflect the proper path. It means a person shouldn't be at either extreme. It is not fitting that a man should behave in accordance with these extremes to teach them to himself. If he finds that his nature leans towards one of the extremes, let's say you're really, really impetuous, very impulsive. So I have that issue. I'm a little bit impulsive. So what should you do? He should bring him back to what is proper and walk in the path of good men. That is the straight path. Don't go to an extreme. Now look what he says in Law 4. This is a really, really famous piece of Maimonides, one of the most famous things that Maimonides ever says. Have you ever heard of Maimonides' golden mean? Anyone ever hear that expression? The golden mean of Maimonides. You've heard that. Excellent. Do you know what it means, the golden mean?
It's like, basically, it's like everything in moderation.
Right, exactly. Over here by the mean, we mean the midpoint. Like when you take statistics in math, the mean is the midpoint. So look what he says in Law 4. The golden mean comes from this statement. The straight path is, this involves discovering the midpoint temperament of each and every trait that man possesses within his personality. This refers to the trait which is equidistant from either of the extremes without being close to either of them. That means ideally, you should walk smack in the middle of all traits. Therefore, the early sages instructed a man to evaluate his traits, to calculate them, and to direct them along the middle path so that he will be of sound of body. For example, now let's see his examples. He should not be wrathful or easily angered, nor be like the dead without feeling. You shouldn't be overly excitable. On the other hand, because if you're overly excitable, then it leads, when a person's too impetuous and impulsive and overly excitable, you know what happens? They start following whatever people tell them without thinking things through, and they start joining the masses, and they'll be quicker to sin because they'll just be impulsive and go after their emotions. But on the other hand, it says you shouldn't be without feeling. You shouldn't be like you're a corpse. You have to have emotion. He should adopt an intermediate path, of course. He should display anger only when the matter is serious enough to warrant it, okay? So Maimonides says the general rule for a person in life is called the golden mean. That means stay in the middle, okay, when it comes to all traits. For example, don't be overly stingy. You got to give charity. But on the other hand, don't just be so impetuous that you give away all your money to anyone who asks without thinking it through and seeing if it's appropriate. That's the general rule. Now, and he says the same thing. Maimonides says over here, don't be overly stingy to spread his money about. He should give charity according to his capacity and lend according to what is fitting. If you can't handle it, you shouldn't give so much money that you can't live yourself, etc., etc., etc. This path is the path of the wise. Every man whose traits are intermediate and equally balanced can be called a wise man. If you live in the middle, you're a wise man. However, we're now going to see, Maimonides says there's a major exception to this rule. So we're going to skip over to chapter 3. We're going to skip over to chapter 2, chapter 2. And he says there's an exception to the rule. How do I get to chapter 2? Here. Okay. Let's go to law number 3. Okay. There are temperaments. That means there are certain character traits which are, with regard to a man is forbidden to follow the middle path. He should move away from one extreme and adopt the other. That means there's certain things where a person should not be in the middle. You should stay all the way to one extreme. Among these is arrogance. If a man is only humble, he is not following a good path. You shouldn't just be a little bit humble. He must hold himself lowly and his spirit very unassuming. That's why the Pasuk describes Moshe, which we just saw in the Pasuk, as being very humble and not simply humble. It says Moshe was anav me'od mikol adam, more humble than anyone, very humble. Now, let me ask you guys, where did Maimonides get this idea from? That when it comes to humility, it's an exception to the general rule, and you should be really, really humble. Where did he see that from? Where did he get it from? What was his source? So his source was what we just saw in Pirkei Avot, that it says, me'od, me'od haveshval ruach. A person should be exceedingly humble. So the next question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the Jewish idea of humility? Why are we supposed to be so humble? And A, and B, why to an extreme? Why should we be humble to an extreme? And C, what could it possibly mean that Moshe was humble? Clearly, Moshe recognized his greatness. Those are the three questions we're going to try to tackle now. Good? Okay. So, all right. Those are the questions we're trying to tackle in order to define what is the purpose and what is the idea of the Jewish trait of humility. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back to a discussion for those of you, which is one of you who's here, who were in my class in the first semester. And we discussed something in the first semester, which the others here will not be familiar with, and that's fine. That is the following. This is like the biggest thing in life. Now, I know I say that a lot. So each time you just have to trust me for that moment until I go to the next thing that's the most important thing in life. So the Mishnah tells us that lefum tsa'ara agra, a person's reward, meaning in the world to come, a person's reward will be commensurate. That means equal to the effort you put in. Okay, so that means if I come to you and I say, Hannah, you're going to be so proud of me. You know why? Because I was driving to Publix yesterday and there was this old lady in front of me who had a yellow light and she could have made it easily, but she decided to stop. And therefore, I got to Publix 3 minutes later and I was in a rush. And I did not pull out a knife and stab her. Aren't you proud of me? You should be so proud of me because it's after all, it is a mitzvah. It's one of the 613 mitzvot not to murder. So you probably would say, no, I'm not so proud of you because I would expect that of you. A person's reward is commensurate with the push they have to give to it, with the effort they have to put in. Now, there are three categories that all actions fit into in your life. There are three categories, which Cami knows very well. The three categories are too easy, too hard, and your point of free will. Too easy means that it's basically no challenge, like not to stab the lady who didn't go through the yellow. For most of us here, not to pickpocket somebody goes into the too easy category because you don't have a tremendous urge to pickpocket. When's the last time that Sarah Wolf went to Publix and she really wanted to just shoplift at Cheerios? Never. Probably never. And then there's another category on the other extreme, which is called too hard. Too hard means Hashem will not punish you for this. It's beyond your capability. So for example, if I tell you, why didn't you have full concentration during your tefillah for 3 prayers a day for the last month without daydreaming at all? Every single word you should be thinking about. You would tell me that's too hard. I'm just incapable of it. Maybe at one point in my life I'll get there. Right now, I'm not capable of it. Hashem's not going to punish somebody for something they're not capable of. That's called the too hard category. All reward and punishment lives in the category that's called the point of free will. The point of free will is where you have a struggle. There's a struggle involved, but you can do it. So for example, you're sitting around at the lunch table with your friends, and one of them says, I heard a really juicy piece of gossip about, so-and-so. Now, you have to struggle in order to have the fortitude to say, I don't think this is appropriate. It takes a lot of strength to be able to do that, but you're capable of it. So that would be in your point of free will. And that's where reward and punishment is. And the more the struggle, lefum tsa'ara, the more the struggle, the more the reward. Reward is completely commensurate with how much push and how much struggle you have to do. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different details of the point of free will, which I did with Cami, but I'm going to go through one or two very important things. 2 different people can have 2 different points of free will. So for example, let's say that let's say that Mia Zohar grew up in a very moral upbringing. Her parents raised her well. They sent her to a nice Jewish school. She had good friends. She does not have a temptation to pickpocket. So Mia goes to the park, and there's this old lady hunched over the water fountain. And you remember the days when you used to be allowed to drink from a water fountain in a park? Remember the days when you used to be allowed to go to the park? So her wallet is sticking out, and Mia does not pickpocket. Okay. Then there's another girl who we'll call Miley Cyrus. And she was raised in an environment where, she was born from a teenage pregnancy, and all her friends are doing drugs. And in order for her to make a living, she had to steal. One day she decides, today I'm going to be really strong. And no matter what happens, no matter how easy it is, I'm not going to pickpocket. So she goes to that same park that Mia went to, and she sees the same lady, and she has the opportunity to pickpocket, and she will not be caught. Mia will get very little reward for not pickpocketing because there's no struggle. There will be a little bit of reward, okay, but very little. Miley is going to get a tremendous amount of reward because Miley had to struggle to not do it. And so everybody's point of free will is in a different place. If that's true, that everybody's point of free will is in a different place, if that's true, then that means that everybody has a different mission in life. So let's say Miley would say to me, Rabbi Jablon, life is not fair because God gave, who was my other example? Mia. God gave Mia a head start in being a good person. She was raised with good parents. She had a good education. She had good friends. She had a good environment. I was raised with a terrible environment, terrible upbringing, terrible role models. So essentially what's hard for me is easy for Mia. So it's not fair. So what would you respond to that? Sarah Wolf, what would you respond to that? If Miley said that to you, life is not fair because look, I start with a handicap as about being a good person, and Mia starts with a head start, what would you respond?
I would probably say that you still need to have these values even through those hard times, like you need to work through them.
Maybe if it's in her point of free will, yes, it could be that it's too hard for her, but the truth of the matter is that everything is fair. You know why? So Cami, tell everybody why it's fair.
So when God is being the referee in the game of life, he's judging you not by how far you've gone, like for example, point A to point Z, but he's judging you about how far you go relative to where you started. So for example, let's say like someone with a really great upbringing, they got a huge head start. So they start at 0.5 and they make it to 0.10. But someone who was maybe, got a really like rough life handed to them, they start at 0.1 and they get to 0.7. Even though they didn't get like objectively as far as the other person, they struggled a lot and put in a lot of effort to improve their lives as much as they could. Therefore, like they will receive the most reward because the reward is equal to the struggle. Perfect.
Cami, I'm very impressed. I'm very proud of you for remembering that. So good. So the bottom line of what Cami just said, to make it a little shorter, is that I don't know why Hannah's laughing. I don't think she thought you're capable of remembering anything. So the bottom line is that everybody has a different finish line. Everyone has a different finish line. As it says in our prayers on the High Holy Days, it says God judges ish ufkudato, a person and their mission. Everyone's mission is different. Miley Cyrus's mission in life will not be to pray 3 times a day with concentration. I promise you that. Her mission in life might be she has to overcome her temptations of pickpocketing, of stealing. Maybe she has to work on being respectful to other people, to her parents. But if you started off where that's not a challenge to you, the point of life is about challenges. If pickpocketing is not a challenge to you, then that's not your mission. Your mission might be praying 3 times a day with concentration, being kind to your parents even when it's a struggle, when they're annoying you, giving tzedakah when it's hard. Everyone is going to have keeping Shabbat when it's hard. Everyone is going to have their own mission. And therefore, the result of this idea is that it's impossible to judge anyone other than Hashem. Hashem is the only one who can judge anyone fully because Hashem knows where everyone starts. And there's a zillion different factors involved in what your finish line is. Meaning, it will depend maybe on how smart you are. How capable are you to learn? Obviously, a child with Down syndrome is not going to be able to learn the same way as other people. You're not going to have the same finish line. It will depend on the influences Hashem arranged in your life. It will depend on the education that you are privileged or not privileged to have. It will depend on the environment you're born into. All these things are things that were in your life without you choosing them. So only Hashem can know that. It is impossible for me to judge somebody else because I do not know where your finish line is. And therefore, coming back to our Parsha, what is the idea of humbleness, of humility? And what does it mean that Moshe was humble? What it means is, humble means it's illogical to boast or to be arrogant and go up to someone else and say, I'm greater than you, when you're comparing yourself to other people. Because comparing yourself to other people makes no sense because you don't have the same job and the same mission as them. So it's like me going up to a Down syndrome kid and saying, Nana boo-boo, I can do algebra, okay, and you can't do 2 + 2. That's absurd. It's ridiculous because what you should be proud of is what you've had to struggle. So for that Down syndrome kid who's able to do 2 + 2, that might have been more of a struggle than for you to do all of pre-algebra. So it is illogical. It's not just mean. It's illogical to compare yourself to somebody else and say that I'm better than you. What it means that Moshe was humble means that Moshe only focused himself on his mission in life. And Moshe was very gifted. He spoke with Hashem. He had an amazing lineage, amazing parents. He had a prophecy. The fact that other people perhaps didn't reach the same place that he did meant nothing to him because we're not in a race or a competition against other people. All we're doing is racing against my own potential. My competition in life is my own potential. And therefore, the commentaries say what it means that Moshe was more humble than everybody else is that Moshe recognized he was extremely gifted. And therefore he didn't look at life as, oh, I'm greater than you. I've gone past you. The question is, how much potential do you have? Moshe had so much potential that he saw himself as I have to keep working and I have to keep working. That's the way he saw it. And the commentaries make the same point over here. I'm going back to the Mishnah that said you should be humble. The Mishnah right before this said, it said, Al tihi baz l'chol adam, which it's translated here in the English as, don't despise any man. Don't discriminate against anything. There's no such thing as a man who doesn't have his hour. Why is it connecting that Mishnah to the next Mishnah about being exceedingly humble? What's the connection? The way to be humble is to recognize that everyone has their own place in life. Arrogance makes no sense if you recognize that you have your own mission. And so, I want to read to you, I couldn't get this online, but I'm going to read it from a book. I want to read to you what a classic Jewish book on ethics called the Orchot Tzadikim, which was written by a rabbi who lived many hundreds of years ago, called the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, what he writes about humility. The humble person takes no pride in any greatness that he may have. This does not mean that he denies its existence. That means he may know he's accomplished a lot, just like Moshe was not dumb. Moshe knew what he accomplished. Instead, he denies its significance. He is constantly thinking of how much improvement there is yet to be done, how much more potential remains unfulfilled. He sees no place for arrogance and pride. So this completely alters our idea of what humility and arrogance is. Humility does not mean to think that, oh, I haven't accomplished anything. If you started keeping part of Shabbat in your life, or you started keeping part of kosher in your life, or you started refraining from speaking hurtful gossip in your life, or you started having more respect for your parents in your life, or being kind to others, you should take tremendous pride in your accomplishments. You should be proud of yourself. You should pat yourself on the back and be exceptionally proud of what you've done because you worked hard to do that. But at the same time, you should be humble. That means that you should recognize that you have more to accomplish. You should never compare yourself to others. I'm sure that we're all friends with other people who are not in the same place that we are spiritually. Maybe they don't do as much of Shabbat as I do. Maybe they don't do kosher as much as I do. Maybe they just don't have the same capacity for kindness that I do. We're all have in our circle of friends people who are in different places than us. Don't compare yourself to them. Be proud of what you've done, but keep pushing yourself based on your potential. That's the Jewish idea of humility. All right, that's the philosophical part of today. Now I want to do a few minutes on some laws of Shabbat, and then I want to end with a story. Okay, my daughter just poked her head in the room and said, "Make Shabbat great again." Thank you. Okay. So I want to look at the laws of Shabbat candles. Now, before we do, does anybody know why is it that there's a custom, it's just a custom, that it's the woman of the home or the women who light the Shabbat candles? Why not the men? Does anyone know the answer to that?
Because women are like a spiritual light in the home, because at the end of the day, it's the women who are taking care and like raising the children. So it really depends on the woman, like what kind of values that her children are brought up with. So it's up to the woman to be like the spiritual and moral light of the family. That's
a beautiful answer. That's great. So in other words, a woman is the mother of the home, is raising the home. She's really the lifeline of the home. So the Shabbat candles are a mitzvah on the home, so the woman does it. It's a great answer. It's a great answer. I was going to share a different answer with you. I believe that one is 100% correct as well. But another answer that's brought in Jewish law is because it was Eve, Chava, who was responsible for mankind sinning. Not that men always try to blame everything on the woman, but in this case, it really is a valid blame in a sense, because the snake went over to Eve, and before this, there was no sin in the world. The snake goes over to Eve and says, "Hey, you touched the fruit, nothing happened to you, so why don't you take a bite?" So she does it, and then she goes over to her husband and says, "Hey, this is cool, why don't you take a bite?" So she was really the one who caused mankind to sin. So therefore, she caused death to come to the world, and she caused the diminishment of the soul. Now, the soul is called the light in the verses. It says, Ki ner Hashem nishmat Adam, that the soul of a person, the soul of God rather, is the ner Hashem, the light of God is the soul of a person. It's like the light of God. So since the soul is called the light, and Eve was responsible for extinguishing the light or diminishing the light, so therefore women try to rectify that by being the ones to bring the light back into the home. Okay, so for today, what I'd like to do is discuss why do we light Shabbat candles in the first place. It doesn't have to be a woman, by the way, but that's the custom. So why do we light Shabbat candles? There are 3 reasons which are given, and all the reasons are true. So that means if you're missing one of the reasons, don't apply. The other ones will still apply. One of them is for Oneg Shabbat. That means to delight in the Shabbat. It means a person enjoys their meal more on Shabbat if there's light there. Now you might say today we have electricity, so we don't need that. Okay, that's true. That's true. But when the mitzvah was originally established, it's a rabbinic mitzvah. It was done for enjoying the Shabbat. Okay, a person enjoys more when there's light. The second reason is called kavod Shabbat, to honor the Shabbat. It's more when you have candles at a table, it makes it distinguished, significant, and that's why your candles are supposed to be by the meal. I don't personally have them right on the table because my son could get to them, but we put them where you could see them in the dining room. And the third reason is shalom bayit, to keep peace in the home. If things are dark, then people are bumping into each other and there's fighting and strife, and therefore an illuminated home makes things peaceful. Those are the 3 reasons for the institution of Shabbat candles. Okay. So next week I want to talk about the time for lighting candles, but for now I want to focus on, I want to tell a little story. I'm going to end with a story. And this story is about Shabbat candles. It's a really cool, true story. So in the 1990s, I don't know what year, but in the 1990s, somebody was reading the New York Times, which of course is the most read newspaper probably in the world. And they said to themselves, you know, there's so many Jewish people who read this, especially in New York City itself. It would be so cool if they would publish the candle lighting times on Fridays. And then all these Jewish people would see it who read the New York Times, and maybe it would inspire them to light Shabbat candles. So this person who had the idea went over to a philanthropist, somebody who gave a lot of charity, and they said, would you be interested in sponsoring an ad, one box, saying Shabbat candle lighting time every Friday? And I don't remember exactly, but I think the ad cost $4,000 for each one. And the person agreed to sponsor it. Now, if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, that means $4,000 a week to get this little box in the New York Times with the candle lighting time. And this went on for a certain amount of time. Okay, a certain amount of years. In June of 1999, this philanthropist who was sponsoring this decided he had other priorities and he couldn't do it anymore. And he stopped sponsoring it. And beginning June of 1999, the candle lighting times stopped appearing in the New York Times. All of a sudden, in January of the year 2000, the beginning of the millennia, the New York Times came out with a special edition on January 1st. And there were 3 front pages. One front page was stories from the past that made the headlines, like very monumental historical things that happened in the past, I guess in the past century or so. And one front page was something they expected in the future. What would you see like in the next millennia? And it was like fake articles. And then one front page was the actual news from that day of 2020. On the page of the future, the future front page for the next millennia, the candle lighting times once again appeared. And a whole bunch of people contacted the New York Times and they wanted to know what happened that all of a sudden for months it hasn't been appearing. And now all of a sudden you have the candle lighting times. So the editor who was responsible for that was Irish Catholic. And he responded that really no one knows what's going to be in the future. So it's pretty hard to guess. But the one thing that we decided we knew for sure was going to be steady in the future is that Jewish women would continue lighting Shabbat candles. And that's why we put that in the future edition. So I don't know if it's still there in the New York Times to this day. I really don't know. Nobody reads the newspaper anyway these days. But I thought it was a pretty cool story. And with that, I want to thank you for coming. I want to wish you an amazing Shabbat. And I'm going to ask you all to please tell your friends to come on next time. They do not need to be in Poznak. They could be in public school. They could be anywhere. And the more the merrier. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful Shabbat.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.
Thanks, Rabbi. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.